School means, from Latin and Greek, to have leisure. Leisure, not to do what you like, partly that, and also to have the capacity or the energy to inquire, to go, to wander about, to look at things, to have leisure, to look around, to look at the trees, the skies, the hills, hear the birds, to see the reflection of the sky on the water, to see how trees grow, the beauty of a tree. That is to have leisure, to inquire not only outside what's happening around you, but also to inquire what is happening inside, in yourself.
Remember that the greatest human beings who have brought change in society have been those who have stood alone and broken away from the past. The Buddha broke away from Hindus. Jesus Christ broke away from the Jews, right? Krishnamurti broke away from the Theosophists. So, to value dissent, therefore, value dissent, and it needs a lot of clarity in your mind. And you must enable the child to come upon that clarity. And it begins with these simple inquiries. What is boredom? Is boredom inevitable? Is worry inevitable?
That's a big challenge. How do you cultivate a sort of stillness? In fact, that stillness accommodates learning, enables learning. So I think restlessness is a lack of attention, and attention is both inner and outer. When your perception is cleansed, you are aware of the outer world and also of the inner world. And that's really what Krishnaji had in mind, that the inner and outer are not different.
In fact, I think that connection with nature is one of the fundamentals of right education, because I mean we are all aware now of what's happening globally, that life becomes so frenetic in a certain way that you have no time to pause and think. And I think nature in some way has an effect of clearing your brain, clearing your mind, to be able to see things more clearly, to be in some way more in contact with yourself also.
So one has to sense what a situation demands. So for example, if you're, let us say, a house parent with, say, senior boys, it's very different from being a house parent with young kids. The young kids come to you all the time, full of complaints about each other and full of all kinds of things. And they want your ear all the time. Older students don't necessarily. They need their space, they need their autonomy. But curiously, they also feel more secure if they know you're there.
In talking about it, we get clearer that comparison has only a very limited way of making a child or a student do a little better. But beyond that, it's over, and it's very dependent on the outside person. Learning or thinking happens when the child or the individual is actually engaging with it because he is interested in it. But that does not mean that we do not give children feedback. We do talk to the children and tell, if you did this in this way, perhaps it would have been a better work. If not better than someone else, better. But at the end, we leave it to the child to see whether he would want to use that input.
It's something which is very, very obvious, and yet something we have succumbed to. it is fear that actually masks creativity or originality. Fear of survival is something that is, again, as an organism, it has come to us through evolution, genetically, whatever. But the psychological fear is something that is cultivated, something that is. So our attempt should be to address that part. The intent is not to overcome fear. It is possible to see that I am able to see the impact of fear on me. So depending on the age group, if you are able to bring in situations and expose, I think to a large extent we have been able to address fear.
What one needs to be conscious of is that actually the children are getting exposed to a hidden curriculum. Okay? And that hidden curriculum is their peer group, is this media, is the kind of books that they are reading and the influences that are falling upon them. So we also need to look at what is the hidden thing which is operating and elicit from the children what is guiding them.
And Krishnamurti, when he came along, I think his major contribution was to go to the heart of the issue. You find in education, there have been multiple approaches to education. This kind of education has never been attempted. We don't know if it's possible. And to teachers, he said, if you're willing to give your life to it, then maybe you'll be transformed. So he shifted the conversation quite dramatically. Now, the influence of that in the school is very profound. The teacher can't say, you follow me and then I'll lead you to wherever. The teacher is a guide, the teacher is a friend, the teacher is a person who is also conditioned. So how do we hold this complex together?
It's not as though it's an idea that they have understood so much as a feeling that they get from the way in which most of us relate to them. They get a feeling that the teacher is not looking at them as part of a mob or a big group, but as individuals. We may agonize that we don't give enough time to each student, but the student himself or herself gets a feeling that she is an individual, she is looked upon as somebody in her own right.
But I think that the Ostachal space we have, post-dinner house contacts we have, continue to be a revelation for me as a teacher, to be able to go together, walk together with young people and suddenly see them speak with a certain dignity and an insight that hasn't manifested in the classroom where they're doing mathematics, for example. And here he is talking about the nature of suffering with such sensitivity, and that establishes a very different ground of relationship amongst people.
Can we pause for this? Yes, let's go.
I think that's part of a responsibility of a school also. It's otherwise a school of that kind, particularly boarding schools, they can easily become like little ivory towers, just they can put a wall around themselves and have almost no relationship with the community. The fact is, in a very real sense, there is a real relationship. Many of the working staff come from the villages. I think it's very necessary to have a back and forth living relationship in terms of health, in terms of education, in terms of some kind of community involvement. I think it's absolutely essential.
It's important more and more young people get into school education like ours, because it's a work that cannot be done by just a handful of people. You need more people, and some of us are also getting older, so we need people who have academic qualifications and also have larger concerns, not just teaching a subject, but go beyond those.
Is it possible to educate not merely the technological academic side, the functional side, but also the psychological nature of man, the cultivation of the wholeness of man, the entirety of man, neglecting neither the one nor the other, nor emphasizing the one or the other, so that a human being grows up harmoniously without any conflict, inward conflict or outward conflict. Is it possible?
Good afternoon to everyone. A very warm welcome to all of the participants who have joined thus far in this webinar, the theme of which is, what is school culture? We've all just watched a few glimpses of a particular kind of school culture in the film that was shown based on the 6 or 7 Krishnamurti schools in India. So today for this webinar, we have our speaker, Dr. Meenakshi Thapan. Dr. Thapan is a trustee of the Krishnamurti Foundation India, and she's also currently the director of Rishi Valley Education Center. Just a brief introduction to Dr. Meenakshi. She encountered Krishnamurti and his teachings very early in her life. In fact, I think it was as a late teenager. And from then on, she has had an ongoing engagement with his educational thought and teachings. She, in fact, even taught briefly at Rishi Valley School in 1974-75. And later, she conducted her doctoral research within this school community. And this led to the publication of her very first book, which was titled Life at School, an Ethnographic Study. This was perhaps the first such study of the school culture which was ever published in India. Subsequently, Meenakshi Thapan had a very distinguished academic career at the University of Delhi, both in the Department of Education and later at the Department of Sociology. She's the author of numerous books, research papers, as well as articles. And before joining Rishi Valley Education Center as its director, she held the positions of Professor of Sociology and Director of the Delhi School of Economics, as well as the head of the D.S. Kothari Center for Science, Ethics and Education at the University of Delhi. So as you can see, Dr. Thapan is very well placed to share with her our thoughts on the theme of this webinar, what is school culture? I now invite Meenakshi to present her views. And after she has spoken, we will have some time where we can have some interaction in the form of questions, which could be typed into the chat box, questions, comments, and she will try and respond to as many as is possible to do within the time that we have. So thank you, and over to you, Meenakshi.
Thank you so much for such a generous introduction, Alok. It's wonderful to be here with all of you to talk about what is school culture. First of all, I must state right at the beginning that I am a student of sociology. So I bring a sociological perspective on this question of what school culture is, which I think Krishnamurti considers essential to the schooling process. So I am not a practitioner, as probably many of you are, teachers and scholars and educators. In a sense I am, but not on a regular basis. So I think I would, please forgive me if I bring this very deeply sociological lens to the understanding of school culture in our schools. I'm going to share the screen now. And okay, so to begin, what is usually understood as school culture or attributes of school culture. These are up there on the screen before you, and these may be understood as the goals of the school in any particular school in question, or the traditions in place in that school. For example, the symbols that are used that stand for something or represent something, whether it's a crest or a logo, and all of this exists in the folklore of the school, right? And this is what is told to teachers, and it's expected that they must fit into that school culture. Now, while these attributes of school culture might change or get modified, such an understanding actually reflects the view that school culture is something that is fixed and outside ourselves, and therefore it depends on others and is already existing in any school. On the contrary, I find in that Krishnamurti schools, while teachers are provided with some kind of an orientation to the school and to its work, in a sense, there is a great deal of openness, there is space with which they slowly absorb and participate in the building of school culture. So school culture is not something outside ourselves. It's some things that we create as participants in the process. Why is it so important? It is because it's like actually the most significant part of being in school is the ethos where children are growing up. It's the space in which they are encompassed and which helps them to grow up. Krishnamurti schools try to be attentive to the many dimensions of a student's growth and do not concern themselves with academic development alone. I think this is one significant difference. The focus on the emotional and developmental aspects of children's development is as much as significant as academic excellence. And this perhaps shapes the school culture in different ways and enriches also the children's experience of schooling because they are in a different kind of school. One of the most important aspects of school culture is that it is our work as participants in school that actually creates the culture. And Krishnamurti's educational thought envisioned a particular kind of school culture, which is not a fixed or static entity. So it is actually in process. It's a culture that is in process. It's not a finished product. So there is continuous movement and fluidity in its creation. I would like to add here, no one else creates this culture, as I have already emphasized earlier. We must understand in this context then, the responsibility of the statement that the school culture depends on us and how we work in creating, maintaining, and seeing that it remains intact. So it's not fixed and it is fluid, but its core characteristics do remain intact. What do we mean by it being in process? It exists, keeps changing because people are changing, people who participate in the life of the school. And it all comes together because of the meanings that we as participants bring to this situation, different situations that are part of school life. I'd like to say that elsewhere, Radhika Hertzberger, who is a senior trustee of the foundation and a former director of the Rishi Valley Education Center, has referred to this process as the coming together of what she calls the institutional and the intuitive. The intuitive aspect of school life is embedded in what she calls transparent silence. The institutional is embedded in authority and hierarchy and the structures that enclose these systems of authority and hierarchy, which are present in any school, right? But it is the intuitive which actually brings another dimension to school culture. And this transparent silence that she talks about doesn't actually refer to thought. It's not shaped by thought. It holds out, as she says, the possibility that the sacred and the silence associated with it would animate this institutional order. So in other words, the institutional aspects and the intuitive aspects actually together create the culture of schools. They are not separate. For purposes of this presentation, we will look at just these 4 aspects of school culture in Krishnamurti schools: self-knowledge in relationship, communication, stillness, and compassion. In his work, Education and Significance of Life, Krishnamurti has written about understanding that comes only through self-knowledge, and which, thus for education, this is the most significant aspect. So the process of knowing oneself is an inextricable part of school culture. It perhaps sounds very abstract and difficult. So how do we do this? Elsewhere, Krishnamurti says, I cannot exist by myself. I exist only in relationship to people, things, and ideas. And in studying my relationship to outward things and people, as well as to inward things, it is then that I begin to understand myself. Right? Now, why is knowing myself so important? It is this quality of seeking to understand myself through relationship that brings a different quality to relationship. I do not know, and I'm in the process of knowing. And through this process, engaging with students, my colleagues, and others. And this brings a tentative quality to the interaction. It's a quality of trying to understand and engage with others from a very tentative state, a very nebulous state, not a fixed state, or an authoritarian state, or one that who knows whether it's a particular subject or how to be in a Krishnamurti school, but trying to be together, finding out. So as we can see, for Krishnamurti, relationship is central to school culture. And this relationship is necessarily based on trust, compassion, understanding, and dialogue, free from authority, hierarchy, fear. And at the same time, there is going to be conflict, because we are to remember the other side of this complex whole, the institutional. Conflict is inevitable in an institutional setting, but how it is sought to be resolved becomes important. Is it done through rules and regulations, or through dialogue, empathy, understanding, patience, some of which is difficult at all times, but perhaps an attempt is being made. And at the same time, there is an emphasis on right behavior, which includes consideration for others. Krishnamurti's emphasis on right conduct and right action emerges from right relationship. And it is indicative actually of his concern with the wholeness of life. Everything is related, not only one aspect of our conduct in relation or to the exclusion of others. It's actually in relation to others, all forms of our conduct. And here dialogue becomes important, as he tells us in this. If you read this slide, it's very significant to see, and in the middle of this paragraph, it is like a bud with untouched blossoms, because the question is left untouched by thought and then has its own answer, because the persons, the questioner and the answerer, have actually disappeared. This is a form of dialogue in which investigation reaches a certain point of intensity and depth, which then has a quality that thought can never reach. So to ensure an integrated school culture, dialogue is essential to relationship. This quality of dialogue between teachers and students among all others at school is described as Krishnamurti describes here, is what we may strive for, thereby enriching school culture. And such a dialogue is not impossible. And recognizing this quality, we remain attentive to achieving it in our communication at school. For example, if I may give an example, it's important to have discussion groups with students and teachers around Krishnamurti's thought and engage with it throughout our everyday lens of life in the school. So we don't look at it as separate from what we are doing at school. And in that sense, we make sense of our worlds as we inhabit them in the school, whether we are students or teachers or administrators and so on. This brings about a quality of sharing, communication, and being on the same page, as it were, so that we are together exploring on how to be together. The differences between teachers and students tend to collapse at such meetings. This has been my experience as we are together exploring, and that brings in another quality to the communication. How we communicate is also important, and here we need to pay attention to the different forms of communication that ensure that the school culture enables a listening ear in all relationships. Bodily hexis, a term in sociology, which actually refers to gestures, physical movement, voice modulation, how we connect with others with our eyes and gaze. And what struck me as being so significant is Krishnamurti's recognition of all these aspects of communication.
First, do you know what communication means? Not by telephone, and that's a different form of communication. But here we are, a group of us, a small community living at Brockwood, and to communicate with each other. Do you know what that word communicate means? Now, there are different forms of communication. Apart from letters, telephone, telegraph, telegrams, and all that. And also there is another form of communication, that is verbally, to tell you something, by gesture, by watching one's eyes, how one speaks. So there is not only a verbal communication, but there is also communication through gesture, through the eye, the way one speaks, the shake of the head. All that is a form of communication. Right? And while one is communicating something, we must both of us think about the same thing. You understand? Otherwise, you might be thinking about something and I might be thinking about something. And I will tell you what I'm thinking about, but you might not listen to it.
So listening to one another and not thinking different things when one is talking or communicating with one another. And this brings us to compassionate communication. What do we mean by this? A spirit of intimate communication, which reflects the ideal state of such communication, or what has been referred to as compassionate communication by Samdong Rinpoche ji, who is a Buddhist scholar and also a senior trustee of the foundation, the Krishnamurti Foundation. Inclusive communication. Inclusive communication includes at school being open to students who may be differently abled or socially disadvantaged, or are going through some kind of identity crisis, whether these are real or imagined, of different kinds. Some children are very sensitive to being, shamed or excluded either by their peers or by teachers. And we need to communicate trust and sensitivity. Inclusive communication also refers to communication with all those who are different, as in being difficult or they are rebellious and show different kinds of behavior to us, which might seem unacceptable in school settings. So while we do not encourage such behavior or particular kinds of tendencies, I think at Krishnamurti schools, we do endeavor and must endeavor to remain open in our communication with all of them. As Radhika Hertzberger has said elsewhere, something rubs off on children, and that is more important than talking and preaching. And she brings in this interview that she gave to someone, the idea of being quiet yourself and communicating this to children rather than get words, using a lot of words, and which children do not necessarily understand. Giving them affection, something positive. So this is the third quality that comes into our discussion, that of stillness. And affection and compassion are part of this communication, but the school culture is also made up of this atmosphere of quietness and affection that communicates itself to children and adults alike. The mind, you can see all aspects of what we've discussed so far present here, of how this aspect comes in through self-knowledge when the mind understands its own process of action, and which cannot happen in isolation but in relationship. Is it possible to instill stillness in a school, which is such a hub of activity and a daily routine that emphasizes a variety of activities that are happening in the classrooms or outside? How can we create such an atmosphere? It is possible if we include some aspects that bring in stillness. As we can see, these are some of the ways through which we may try to enrich school culture. And these practices may vary in the different schools, in all the Krishnamurti schools, but they are part of the culture of each school, as we saw in the film that was shown to us at the start of this webinar. Whether it's someone talked about Astachal in that film, we saw children going to quiet places to reflect on the day or what was coming next. Whether it's part of the assembly practices in school or quiet time. And what is important is that if they are posted in the routine, they become part of everyday life. They're interwoven into the fabric of school life and are part of the processes of learning that constitute schooling. I think this is really important for school culture, for it to be part, not something separately that we do. We go out and sit in a quiet room and meditate for 10 minutes a day. But how is it embedded in our daily lives as part of what we are doing throughout the school day, which is a busy, hectic day, right? Compassion, or the lack of it, affects all relationships at school. Not only with each other as peers or as educators or learners, but also compassion for the inequities in society and our engagement with addressing them. And finally, with the earth, so that we can protect, preserve, and nurture it. The opening out of ourselves, this is what such compassion indicates, is part of the school culture. It is important to move away from a very self-centered approach to one that encompasses others within it, whoever those others may be, different from us. in their habits, in their traditions, in their religion, in their ethnicities, in their caste status or gender identities, and so many aspects. I think that is what we might understand as compassion in the context of an inclusive education, right? And here Krishnaji talked about compassion as a rock. For Krishnamurti, compassion was not a personal feeling for someone or directed at a particular individual. And neither was it the doing of charitable acts or social reforms. It is like a great rock, immovable in the midst of confusion, misery, and anxiety. Without this compassion, no new culture or society can come into being. Compassion is the essence of the wholeness of life. So what happens at school when we want to address or engage with marginalized sections of society? How do we do this? Paying attention to that aspect of our social existence, not only through culture classes and assemblies, but also participation in the outreach programs in which our children do participate in a continuous basis. All our schools have these outreach programs so that the consciousness is not focused only on the self, is not self-centered, but opens itself out towards others. And this is something we refer to, I would like to refer to as secular or a universal morality. I think it's really important at school, especially in the times we live in, to help children understand the significance of this secular and universal morality that is inclusive and not adhere to particular national, religious, or ethnic or race or caste guidelines, that it encompasses all in its universality. I think this is an essential part of school culture. And for example, I might mention that the general studies course in our schools is a great opportunity to engage with the rural work of our centers, so that the school culture is enriched by this opening out of the self towards others, whether it's our own initiatives or those of local farmers, weavers, potters. Let us together observe their work, participate, and reflect on it, so that it becomes again an important part of our everyday. Not something that we do once in a term or, occasionally, but part of our everyday life. And this would enable and does enable a culture of compassion where there are rural initiatives in all our schools of different kinds. At the same time, compassion for the earth. And as we can see that, as you might know, and as you might understand from the websites and the work of the different schools, that all our schools are engaged in this process of caring for the earth through different kinds of practices that address these very urgent concerns. Whether these practices include farming, land work of different kinds, waste segregation, using biodegradable products. And through this and other activities, we try to build an awareness about research on climate change, for example, and its disaster consequences, that ensures that children are deeply conscious and engaged in climate change issues. So these are the 4 aspects that I took up for today's presentation. At the same time, I would like to just briefly mention some of the challenges and contentious issues that are there as part of the school culture. They don't lie outside it. They are embedded also within the school culture. What are the challenges? Krishnamurti understood this very well. How? Because there is such a vast diversity of participants in the schools. I have helped to form several schools in India. And this has been one of the major problems, how to deal with the parent who's conditioned, the child, the children also conditioned because they live with their parents, with the society, with their group, and the teacher who is also conditioned. in the sense that they are prejudiced, they are violent, they are nationalistic, class conscious, the rich and the poor, the Hindu, the Muslim, the Christian, conditioned. Now, how to deal with this problem, both at home and in the school? So there are difficulties of working with parents from very diverse backgrounds and interests, social pressures which they have internalized and they pass on to their children. There are also teachers who, apart from what Krishnaji has mentioned here, also may seek to change school culture according to perhaps their more contemporary concerns and ideas about a different kind of education. However, we seek to work within Krishnamurti's framework that actually urges us to help children to grow up slowly and not be pushed or rush into modernity with all its travails. All that is happening anyway through the influence of social media and the peer group culture. But perhaps at school, we can take a step back and try to hold on to the fact that we need not rush into modernity. Nonetheless, we cannot deny that such ideas are present and they do enter the culture of a school and need to be addressed by the participants who are also part of this culture. And this is exactly what the making and remaking of culture is all about at school. How do we make it and then remake it according to what we think is important? What are the contentious issues? One of the most contentious issues is that of freedom, and which may not actually gel with students' ideas of what freedom is. Their engagement with social media and its influences also affects the culture of the school. The significance of identity of different kinds, which is again coming in from the media and also from peer group cultures which exist. And this peer group culture is also not homogeneous. It is a very heterogeneous culture because there are different groups of students who would emphasize different aspects of growing up or identity issues. And gender and sexuality issues are amplified, especially in current times. And sometimes a focus on discipline perhaps might overwhelm us. But to look at the first point, which is Krishnamurti's emphasis on freedom, this is primarily one of the main reasons for the disruption of school cultures, because everybody has different interpretations of what freedom is. But Krishnamurti was very clear, the school is concerned with freedom and order. It's not the expression of one's own desire, choice, or self-interest, though it might appear to be so. Nor is order conformity or imitation. Order can only come with the insight that to choose itself is the very denial of freedom. So then how do we maintain this school culture without allowing it to become crystallized or fixed or something that is, made permanent and can never be changed or can never be modified? We recognize how essential it is to actually enrich, maintain, and reproduce the valuable aspects of this culture as delineated by Krishnamurti. And this is very difficult today because of the kind of world we inhabit. As you know, there's war going on across Europe. It's the biggest war after World War II. And these kind of wars are based on divisive policies. There's the agony of climate change taking place and aggressive nationalism. All this is part of the world in which we live. And yet we must have a school culture that perhaps encompasses all this, but at the same time is able to bring to children a different way of looking at things. Because children do imbibe school culture. willingly or unwittingly, even if they are rebellious, they resist, but it enters their consciousness and stays with them. We have this examples of this in quotations from children who have been interviewed later, who talk about their experience at school and what they learned here. It stays with them as they move through life. And in a sense, it is at the heart of all educational processes in a Krishnamurti school. So we therefore steadfastly hold on to the vision of the founder in our goals and the methods we use to accomplish them, but also through the processes that make up the everyday life of the school. We focus on those aspects that enrich and embody this culture. Those are important, that are important to us for over the years and with which we have engaged in this process. So we don't lose our focus on them because of everything else going on in the world. Even though it's changing rapidly, violence is far more present in a very banal form. So it's more accepted and it's tolerated much more than it was in earlier years when we questioned it to a far greater extent. Now it's just become part of everyday life. You open the newspaper and there's some or the other act of violence that has occurred, not in one city alone in India, but in several towns, small towns in rural areas, whether it's gender-based violence or caste-based or any kind of violence. We may seek to address all this through particular activities with affection, compassion, and stillness. But we also need to and must, and we do strive to understand how we may contribute to the maintenance and development of this culture in the complex times we live in. So it's like we are walking on a razor's edge at a Krishnamurti school. I don't think it is as it was in the past. The society has, Krishnaji actually predicted it all. And society has degenerated much more, as he said it would. The use of computers and internet and so on has only fastened or quickened that process. So in this complex world that we inhabit, holding on to the school culture that actually we value and cherish and would like to see continue, without letting it get fixed and become a thing, an entity that everybody adheres to, like some kind of, commandments, without letting that happen, but actually keeping it alive, something unique, something that we want to continuously work with, we are willing to work with and willing to modify, keeping intact our core, I hesitate to use the word values, but core criteria or core characteristics of that culture. Thank you so much.
So we still have quite a bit of time in this session. So I would invite any of the participants to share their questions either in the Q&A box. I think that might be the better place to do it rather than the chat box, since there is a separate Q&A box, I noticed. And there already is one large question there. I'm wondering whether we should start from there. So, Meenakshi, I will just share this question with you because you may not be able to see it. It's from Amir Hyuga. I think he's from Japan. And
I can see it actually. Yeah, anyhow. Why don't you sum it up? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll have to read it actually, and then maybe you could sum it up and then respond. Yeah, Krishnamurti suggested that when one teaches history, one should teach the history of the human being relating to ourselves when teaching maths, one could relate to order, order in ourselves, that is in consciousness. In science, how we relate with our environment, nature, and when teaching language, the right and precise meaning of communication and words and how they condition us, and how to communicate and relate to each other and so on and so forth. So I think the question here is now, can a teacher mix all together and teach in this way every day? Can everyday lessons start with talking about the art of life, seeing, listening, learning, and discussing with kids? How would be the best way to implement the teachings in our daily lessons and not be caught with the limitations of subject boundaries? For a small school, and he says, I'm planning to start one in Japan, should a school accept any kind of student or try to avoid families which can be especially problematic from the beginning after meeting and understanding more about them and their background? So there are really two separate questions. One is addressed to how should one teach in a school which would like to bring in Krishnamurti's outlook? And secondly, what about the choice of the parents and the children who join the school? Meenakshi, would you like to respond to?
Yes, yes, I'll do that. So I think what I was talking about was also about relationship. So it's while you might do it in your classes, subject classes and so on, it's not essential that you need to do this on a daily basis. It's in your relationship with students which take place, which is not only restricted to classroom spaces, but continuously in the space of the school. That is where this conversation is taking place, along with the conversation that takes place within the classroom, and even within the classroom, how we connect with students and how students connect to us. I think that is where many of the points that you've raised, the communication on how they condition us and how to communicate to relate to each other, gets expanded out. It's not just within the space of the classroom setting, right? And certainly not be caught. But at the same time, let me tell you that it also in the teaching of history, we can bring about, and this has been done. Somebody has mentioned that it looks like a self-praise of the Krishnamurti schools. I'm afraid I'm most familiar with the Krishnamurti schools, so my examples are from there. And this particular aspect of teaching of history in the Krishnamurti schools, for example, is possibly done when we talk about nationalism in history. So how do we communicate this idea to children? It can be done through particular subjects. So it is not necessary that it is done only in the classroom, but it may be done in the classroom, outside the space of the classroom, and so on. In your life with children in a school, where if you're planning to start a school, you will probably spend a lot of time there with the students and with teachers. For a small school, another part of your question is, should a school accept any kind of student or try to avoid families? That's up to you. If you want parents who obviously are open to the kind of work you're doing and support it, would help you in your own work, right? Rather than parents who are expecting a very different kind of education, perhaps based more on competition and relationship to the kind of academic knowledge that, the sort of skills that might be needed to sit for competitive exams and so on. You may not want to take those kind of children of those kind of parents into your school, because they would have different expectations, right? And you also have a question on, should we make the parents understand that the school is based on Krishnamurti's educational philosophy? Yes, you must, because that is what your goal is. And only if their goals match with you, perhaps it might be helpful. But at the same time, you're saying to be very open and grant admission to or take in children from very different kinds of backgrounds whose parents may not be. That's up to you. How would you like to run the school? Yes, Alok, if I may come back to you.
Yeah. I think there are at least 2 or 3 questions connected with the notion of freedom. And I think they're asking, can you elaborate a little bit more on what could it mean? What could freedom mean in the context of a school culture? And is it not in very much in conflict with the kind of pressures that exist today in society? That's the implication, I think, of one of the other questions.
Sorry, just say that again.
What would be the instance of, how would you see freedom in the context of a school culture? Can you give some examples of it? And second, corollary to that question is the notion of freedom that you talk about in the school cultures that you're familiar with, is it very much in contradiction or in conflict with the way freedom is seen today in society? How does it become relevant?
Yeah, so I think to take this question first, freedom in the school is in conflict because freedom outside is perceived very differently, as in that quotation from Krishnaji which I cited. It is to choose, the freedom of choice, the freedom to do whatever I like, the freedom of whether it's in terms of, whether I want to keep my hair very long or I want to keep it short, or wear the kind of clothes that I would like to wear, the freedom to make certain choices, which are bigger choices, not simply in terms of dress and hair, but in terms of the subjects you wish to study. So there are certain guidelines that would be there in any school setting. And I think what we try to enable is that not to ensure that they are not necessarily imposed as rules and regulations, but as something which we try to understand together, that is it possible to do something like this? So what is the freedom in a school culture? Freedom in a school culture, obviously we need to talk to children about making choices or being, for example, there was that question, one of the things I mentioned is that Krishnaji also talked about right action, right conduct. So does that mean that freedom means we can sit in the dining hall, again, giving a very particular example, and eat our food in a leisurely way, continue to talk with our friends and keep sitting there for a long time? Does it mean that? That is, as a student, if I think that is freedom, then I'm not really cognizant or not really mindful of others who are working for us in the dining hall, might need to also eat their food or clean up and go home, and their families are waiting for them, and so on and so forth. So I'm just giving you a very specific example to see at what kind of conflict might appear. But at the same time, I must say that children are very sensitive. And when this is pointed out to them, it's not that that they rebel or they don't accept it. It is the case that children understand that, and it's perhaps something, oh, we didn't look at it like that or didn't think of it like that, and become mindful of themselves in the next instance. So I don't think it is a conflict that is a lasting conflict, but it may happen and it needs to be resolved and addressed.
So Meenakshi, there are a few other questions I think related with the concept of freedom, and maybe because there are several questions, so I'll just pick those out and we'll come to some other theme after that. So one question by Tanya Sinha is that how students of Krishnamurti school manage the higher education system that doesn't provide them with the freedom of learning that these schools seek to provide. Do they try to bring about a change in those higher institutions, or how do they cope? I'm adding that as a corollary.
Do they try to bring about change in those higher institutions, right?
Yeah.
So I think what I've understood is you're not really talking about high school, because our schools all go up to the high school. You mentioned high school in the question, but perhaps it's higher educational institutions you have in mind. So definitely there is a shift in the kind of expectations that higher educational institutions happen to have in place for students who go from our schools. But at the same time, I want to say at one level, which is a level where they're expected, there are difficulties in terms of you're expected to conduct yourself in a particular way, address teachers in a particular way, stand up when a teacher walks into the classroom. Some of those things are perhaps that students for some time may have to come around or come to terms with and modify themselves accordingly. But in a larger sense, as you probably know, as all of you probably know, higher education institutions are institutions where there is a great deal of freedom, much more than any school setting, right? And students are actually left to fend for themselves. In our schools, in all our schools, they are not just Krishnamurti schools, in many schools, they are protected in the space of the school. They have, it's a setting, like a home setting that is created. And teachers are like siblings or parents taking care of them. So I think it has a double side to it. On the one side, higher education opens up a whole world to students which they don't see in school. They have access to many institutional facilities which our schools may not offer them. They have access, open access to different kinds of teachers in a variety of disciplines. They can access different kinds of classes. There's a lot that goes on in higher education which is not there in school. And on the other hand, yes, they do have difficulties to start with in terms of what is expected from them as students, that too first year students, who have to be submissive, and not just to teachers but also to their seniors, have to behave in a particular way. But they get over that. It's not something that I was in the university for a long period of time, and I did come across this issue with children from our schools, but they overcome it. It's not something that stays for a long time. Yeah.
So those were a set of questions related to freedom. I'm just moving to a slightly different question. Then I'll come back to another burning question about freedom right now. But there's a question from Mr. Oscar Gomes. How do you deal with the legally enforced nationalism that is normally forced on schools by the government? This is also a very pertinent issue today.
What do you mean legally enforced? I'm not very clear on this.
Yeah, I mean, you'll have to interpret it because unless...
Okay, so legally enforced means the kind of issues that the government is currently, or let's say governments from time to time emphasize, right? A kind of nationalism that would be incompatible with Krishnamurti's idea of personhood, let's say. That is, what he talked about was the global outlook, right? Or that I belong to many cultures. I don't actually belong, but I may belong in the way I appreciate music of different kinds, or different kinds of things. And I'm openness, the openness. I think the schools that are concerned with this kind of school culture, let me broaden my use of the term schools, is that there would be a concern with actually ensuring that there is the development of a global outlook. And again, when you're teaching nationalism, to bring out the limitations of nationalism in terms of identity, Krishnamurti talked a lot about identity and the pitfalls of identification with, as he put it, with a particular nation, or with a particular group, or with a particular ideology, whether it's the left or the right, or the, any of those identifications with are problematic. And this is what we try to do with children, bring to their attention, draw their attention to it, and they do see it, they recognize, because fortunately they have not been as conditioned as we are. And their minds are very open to different points of view. They do recognize the limitations of a nationalistic approach, and they see the difference between nationalism and patriotism, for example. So I think this is possible, and as far as I know, there's nothing legally imposed on us. It's a point of view that is being professed by certain people and certain groups, and it's possible to contest and to have your own idea of what you want to do through your schools, right?
Yeah, there's a more specific question which I thought I will reflect back, because it's been put twice and it's related to, again, I think all these issues. Is uniformity of dress code an inevitable part of school culture? How would you look at it?
So, well, we do not actually have uniform per se, right? Of dress in our schools. And there are many schools now, many private schools, which adhere to this. The plus side of a uniform, having a uniform dress code, is that everybody wears the same dress, right? And there are no differences. So you can't, nobody can wear particular kind of clothes, which are, I think this is the question is about dress code, if I'm not wrong.
Yes, yes,
Yeah?
yes.
So it's not that it is, everybody wears the same, so everybody's alike. But at the same time, that gives a false sense of similarity to my mind. It provides a false sense of that everybody is the same. Because of course there are socio-economic differences, there are gender differences, and it's not that those are washed away with just putting a uniform on, the same uniform onto everybody. What the lack of uniform does is provide everybody the opportunity to wear comfortable clothes, which are in a particular way, adhering to a certain dress code of a particular school. So clothes that would not necessarily draw attention to your embodiment, to your, to how you want to present yourself necessarily. They are just functional, practical clothes which you would wear at home to go to school or to go to a particular, event that is an educational event. And of course, this has its plus side and its minus. The minus being that there will always be conflict about what children think is okay and what teachers or schools might think is okay, right? As what constitutes the correct dress code, even when there's no uniform. But like I said, even with a uniform, it's only a false sense. It's not that of similarity, of uniformity. It's just like a cover. But actually there are differences, and it's the same when there's no uniform. There are differences. And yes, we have to struggle with that and yet keep it intact, like not let it become a big issue for something we have to quarrel over with and spend endless hours discussing, because it takes away from other time, right? Yeah, I hope I've answered your question.
So I'll take a different kind of question now. There's a question from Mr. Shakti Kumar. When a student leaves a K school, is she or he acquainted with the relevance of inner attention towards thought feelings apart from the outer attention, even as a hypothesis for testing out whether it is possible or not? Does it happen? I think he is asking, what has been your experience? Does this happen that students are actually acquainted with the relevance of inner attention?
It's a very good question. And I'm not sure that I am the best person to answer it, because I have not worked with students who pass out from our schools and come back and engage with us over a period of time to understand this, whether this inner attention is there. But we did some time ago there was a conference in Canada where we actually, only a few months, maybe 6 or 8, 9 months ago, where we asked some of our former students from the school and from Rishi Valley and from, I think it was, if I'm not wrong, the Valley School, to talk about their experiences and the levels at which they engaged with what had remained with them after they left school. It was actually quite fascinating to hear, because much of it was to do with compassion, as we talked about earlier. Compassion, one of the students talked at great length about compassion in her to the earth and to nature, and how that has stayed with her over the years, although she's living in the United States, in Los Angeles, and working in film, making films. So that state of inner attention at some point must have been active or present, whatever word you want to use, for it to have stayed with her all those years later, right? that experience. Now, whether that came through, I don't know, because we did not ask questions. Whether it came through watching the sunset or just being part of a school setting where this was something that teachers engaged with a lot or talked about a lot, or where they thought, because at one time I had students a long time ago write about the experiences of Astachal, and they wrote about this, exactly what you've said and exactly what Krishnaji says about thought feelings, about how it's a coming together of the cognitive, because I've been studying all day and I'm going back to study in the evening after Astachal. And yet at this moment, the space that it gives me for my feelings to reflect upon them, to understand myself, how there's a coming together of that. Now, whether this stays on, I'm not sure, because I've not done research or talked to too many students about this aspect. But it's a good question. Thank you so much for it.
There are two questions, I think, connected in some ways. One in the question answer, the other in the chat box. I thought I'll pose both the questions simultaneously to you. I think one sort of leads to the other. So Ashmit Baweja has a statement here first. He says, as Carl Jung says, that children are educated by what the grown-up is, not by his talk. And I think in your presentation also you implied that. So living those desired learning outcomes are essential. What is the best way to build up this culture without it becoming a moral imperative on the adults? That's one way of framing the question. A more direct way, which Puneet Pandey asks, is, Dr. Meenakshi, I've always wondered, how does conditioning of teachers themselves get resolved at the KFI schools once they become a part of the KFI community? So I think that there's a link between these two questions. And
yes,
yeah.
Thank you. This is, there is a link, and thank you for this question as well. This is what I perhaps should have emphasized, that it should not become a model. I think I did refer to it as becoming something, like a set of commandments. Like you say, it becomes a moral imperative that we all have to adhere to this culture. No, the culture should not be that. And I think one of the things that former students of the schools have certainly talked about is the manner in which teachers at the schools themselves conduct themselves. This has often been referred to, that they are the kind of living examples of what they are trying to do. Not all teachers, but many teachers whom they remember long after they've left school. I don't want to name teachers here. I don't want to talk about it in greater detail, but this has been talked about, including things such as simplicity of life, of the kind of clothes that teachers wear, of being satisfied, of living in communities that are often isolated without the luxuries of being able to, the trappings of modernity, so to speak. Not having access, even though we can. It's not like our teachers are underqualified. They are perfectly well qualified and overqualified to find occupations elsewhere. But this is a choice that they have made to work in such settings where they feel they can make a difference. In every school, there will be a mix of teachers. There will not be all teachers like this, okay? There will be a mix. There are many who are coming to use schools as a stepping stone in their career. There are many who come for a variety of other reasons, but many do come with that. And children are very quick to grasp this. And this is something I have observed over the years, that this is remembered by children long after they've left school. And it certainly impacts you as a parent. If you visit the school, you enter the house parents' accommodation, which is simply furnished and very simply, it's a very simple life. So I don't think there is a contradiction in that sense there. Now, this doesn't mean I'm trying to gloss over or hide the contradictions which are perhaps apparent also. There must be other teachers, there are other teachers who perhaps are not that sensitive, who perhaps give a different image or a different, let's say, a different image to the children. And I'm sure that happens as well. About the second point about whether there is conditioning that is taking place of those teachers. Yes, perhaps there is. And which is why the kind of things I talked about earlier, the Krishnamurti group discussions of Krishnamurti's thought, not in an abstract sense, but in a sense of engaging with him or his work or the teachings in our everyday life, through the lens of our everyday life, whether it's as teachers or as administrators or as students. And when we do it together, it brings a different understanding to the whole context, right? So I think the conditioning can be helped by such discussions. Yes, and there is a danger, as you rightly point out, that after spending many years in a Krishnamurti school, you probably are conditioned in a particular way, which it is then difficult to get out of because you've been there for so long and you have a certain view, a tunnel vision of looking at things, and you perhaps need to modify that or change that. So yes, it is a challenge, let's put it like that. That should be one of the challenges which I did not talk about. Thank you for bringing it to my attention.
Shall I take reflect back another question to you of a different kind and which is often also asked? If the Krishnamurti schools are more aware of inclusiveness, if the Krishnamurti schools are more aware of inclusiveness, why do we see more elite background students studying in the KFI schools? Why children from lower castes and perhaps class can't access this kind of education? Is there any response to that?
Yeah, they can access it and they do. And it's not only because of 25% reservation to the Right to Education Act. They can access. We have very good scholarships available for children whose parents are interested in this kind of an approach, and they do apply. And they are from very different backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, and very different profiles from other children whose parents are, as you say, from the elite, okay, sections of society. And at this point, I want to say two things. One is, yes, it is open for all children who belong to all sections of society, and there is a robust scholarship scheme in place which can help these children. At the same time, I would like to ask, why is it considered a malpractice to educate children of the elite? Are these children not going to be part of the bureaucracy in the future or part of the decision-making processes in this country? Is it not important to also provide them with this kind of an education that helps them to think out of the box? Many of our children who pass out of this school don't necessarily join the family business or become what their parents expect them to become. They also become environmentalists. They also become people who work for the poor and the marginalized. Let's not box schools into a particular category. I've heard this forever, that Krishnamurti schools cater to the elite. All the Krishnamurti schools also have rural initiatives and education. And all of those initiatives are doing exceedingly good work. Why is it that we never want to recognize those or pay attention to the work of those? And why is it that our eyes are only focused on the education of the elite? And why is education of the elite such a bad thing? If the children who come here belong to families that are economically privileged, some more than others, some less, because that also, it's not a homogeneous group, it's a heterogeneous group of children from heterogeneous backgrounds. they do find a different way of looking at things. There is a culture that is inculcated on them, and I do not necessarily see this as a bad thing. I think this is also a contribution to society, because Indian society is not only of one homogeneous group. And the other group that you mentioned, the castes and the low class and so on, they are also present. And when they wish to, they are also present in all our other schools that we have, the rural schools of different kinds. So, or the children who are enrolled in our day school. So I don't think we should separate or try to, make it into a situation of conflict when at least I don't see it as one. Thank you.
So there are so many questions that I'm finding it difficult to sort out and see. So I'm trying to take a spectrum of questions, which are different in nature. And maybe we'll take one which is outside of the Krishnamurti schools. This Amit Kohi says, I work with a school meant for tribal children.
Sorry?
I work with a school meant for tribal children. They carry values. They carry their own values, that is community life, being with nature, self-contented life. However, the school culture in itself, through curriculum, symbols, academic rituals, etc. Wait a minute, it's moved. Rituals tends to impose individualism, self-consciousness, competition, sense of progress as a form of greed. If they get schooled, they tend to lose their indigenous values and identity. It seems to be embedded in the school culture itself. How might one deal with this?
Yeah, so thank you for this question. I think you have formulated it so well that is what schooling does. It dehumanizes you in a way. It's the being schooled means you lose your own culture, that culture of your community and the where you're in the environment in which you're growing up and so on. And I think it's, as I've been saying throughout this afternoon, school culture is made by us, right? There is a curriculum, there is a syllabus, there is a entire plethora of activities associated with being at school. Textbooks, whether they promote nationalism or not, there's endless kind of school work that we have to do. But how do we create it? How do you create it in the setting of a school in a tribal area? How do you work with Adivasi children with that same curriculum, with the same syllabus, but organizing yourself differently, communicating differently with the children, making sure that competition, that self-advancement or self-centeredness that you mentioned is not there, that it's actually they are developing this kind of global. I think that is the relevance of what I was trying to say, that this school culture, perhaps I didn't articulate it well enough, this school culture is made by us. The Krishnamurti schools, it's not, some questions are saying it's linked to it's only about Krishnamurti schools, but Krishnamurti schools are not an island. They follow the board, they follow either it's the CBSE or the ISC or the IGCSE. They are affiliated to a school system. So how do you, within that school system, make it different? How do you construct that school culture so that your children are a part of something where you're trying to communicate something different with them? And yes, you can do it through indigenous language as well as the language of the school. So you have to have that kind of a multi-layered approach to education in such schools. I think it's in your hands, Miss. I didn't get the name of the panel, the questioner. Amit, you said.
Amit, yes. Amit.
Yes, maybe Amit, it's in your hands. How do you construct it with your colleagues? Talk about these things that you think are important for the school culture to be, and you can create it. It's not some gods in heaven, as Krishnamurti used to say, who are going to create the world for you. It's you who create the world, right? It's possible. If it can be done in a Krishnamurti school with all its glitches, I'm not saying it's perfect. There are glitches, there are challenges. I talked about contentious issues. All of that is happening. But it's still possible is what the point I'm saying. Is it possible for you to do it or not? Just examine. Amit? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think a parallel question, I would say, from Sudeshna Sinha. The majority of schools are outside of the K schools. Is it possible for a sensitive teacher with 50 students in class to communicate this kind of culture to the students on her own, or unless it is not part of the school? Oh, sorry, it keeps jumping. Huh?
Because the next question comes.
Something keeps happening. You know, this is trouble with these tiny technological boxes. I'm so sorry. I couldn't complete your question, Sudeshna. Yeah, or unless it is not part of the school curriculum, is it difficult? And I think Sudeshna speaks from her own experience of working in a school in Calcutta, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
Yes, it is. It is difficult. I've been asked this question by teachers who are doing practice teaching in schools in Delhi University, and they go to teach where their children from 40 to 50 children. I've sat in a classroom at the back where I had to jump over the school bags to get to the seat at the back. And it is difficult. It's very difficult, and yet I think one can make the effort and try to do this in different ways. And I always say that the teacher's role doesn't end in the classroom. Even in a government school, you do spend time outside the classroom. Unfortunately, at least in the government schools which I have looked at and done field work in, teachers tend to go back to their staff room and sit there with their colleagues and don't interact much with the children. In many such schools, perhaps because of a class divide, perhaps because they have an attitude towards children which is different. But if they do that, if you spend time with children, wherever you are, in the corridors, in the canteen, on the ground outside, it is possible to communicate some of what we've been talking about. It's not impossible. It is difficult, but not impossible. I see the difficulties of doing this with 50. I've seen it actually in school settings. I know where you're coming from. But there'll always be that one child who will be listening to you and who comes up to you later and says, can you tell me about this, or can we talk about this? And it's up to you how sensitive you are. You are sensitive to be able to talk to that, communicate with that child. Even if it's one child, it's not that we have to convert all 50 to our way of thinking or to what you feel is important in life. Work and talk to children in the spaces outside the classroom. Don't restrict your conversations with them only to the classroom space, even in a day school. It's perfectly possible.
Maybe we'll take a very different kind of question, which is in the question answer panel. It is from Donald Creedon. He says, kindly expand on the quality of transparent silence, which you have spoken about, which you say is essential to culture. How does this come about?
I think this was a point that I carried from Radhika ji's writing about the intuitive and institutional orders in a school, and the institutional being located in the hierarchy and authority and the structures of the school, whereas the intuitive being the sacred dimension. And I think she would be the best person to answer your question. Perhaps you could send her an email or write to her or talk to her about it. But I would only say this much, that she does say that this is it is Krishnamurti who points us or suggests the possibility that the sacred dimension rests in the intuitive, and this can animate the other. That is the institutional, which is so powerful because we are all trapped in the exams, the syllabus, the curriculum. That is overpowering, right? And what can transform it is the intuitive, is this transparent silence. I'm afraid I can do no more than that. Perhaps if you would like to, you could engage with her yourself. Thank you.
A question from Mr. Anand Swami, maybe slightly parallel with the previous one. Krishnaji very much emphasized that learning, including in K schools, should be both at the level of students and teachers together. Teachers are to be aware that understanding, change, and transformation is to happen in everyone connected with education. Is this happening or given attention to in the context of the culture of a school? You've already mentioned the discussions between students and teachers where, but are there any other factors which you might like
No,
to?
it is and it's not. Both the things are there. It is happening and it's happening more with some teachers. I think Alok has himself spent a long time in Krishnamurti schools, but not with all teachers. And as I said, the other thing I want to say and emphasize, I've said it throughout the talk, that culture is in process. Krishnamurti's work is in process. It's not a completed project. In none of his schools, I think, at least to my mind, is Krishnamurti's work a finished product. Even the children who leave school, even the teachers who go to other schools, just because if they've spent 20 years here or whatever, 30, 40 years, are they finished products in the Krishnamurti sense? Huh? Or same with the students. So it's a continuous process. And I think the fact that they are aware that students and teachers together are in this process of understanding change and transformation. And yes, it is continuous. I cannot say it's happened. It will never happen because everybody is so, bewildered by the number of activities that happen or that we are caught up in our teaching. I don't want to look at it in a negative way, but I do think it's possible and it happens, but it's a slow process. It's not a finished product. I think we need to recognize that no Krishnamurti, there often questions are asked about former students, so are they the changed individuals? Have we got that one transformed human being that Krishnaji talked about, who is open and who will change society? And we don't know. It's part of a process that is continuing. It's a continuing process.
Okay, here's a very pertinent contemporary question. Gen Z, that is Generation Z, I guess, new generation.
Sorry, where is this in the question and answers?
Yeah, it's in the question and answers right at the end. So I'm scrolling up and down and trying to look for different kinds of questions.
I don't know what is Gen Z.
Gen Z, I think, means the new generation who's coming in now, are true digital natives, and digital dependency in schools are on a high. How do KFI schools deal with this, especially today, post the pandemic? I think the pandemic has thrown, many of things, into a very different gear.
Exactly.
So maybe some comment in that would be very pertinent to share with.
Yeah, exactly. It's a very good question also, like all the others. See, what I feel is that online education increased our dependency on digital media. We had to rely on that in order to conduct. We couldn't sit, the children could not have been without schooling for 2 years or more. At the same time, we also realized that those 2 years have been a great loss in terms of schooling, in terms of education, because everything I spoke about today was not possible when you're doing online education, okay? The school culture does not exist online. It's not possible. It will exist in a fragmentary way. It cannot exist in the sense in which I tried to talk about it. So that is the first limitation. And let me tell you, the children have been back in the school where I work, at least now for 2 terms, and they are the most excited to be back. Everybody else is working so hard to keep everything together, but the children are the happiest. And that is because they are no longer relying on this computer screen to meet their teachers or to see their peers. I think from us, that's the greatest satisfaction, and knowing that children are not dependent on the digital media, however savvy they are. Yes, they are all savvy. While they are in our schools, they have no access to the internet except for certain course-related activities, discipline subject-related activities. They cannot access social media. They don't have telephones, mobile phones, or smartphones, or anything of that. Only during COVID, when they wanted to, when the parents needed to talk to them and so on. Otherwise, they've been without. So I think it's, I don't think all hope is lost. I think children know that, yes, they love it and they do it when they are at home, but they are so happy to be here and engaging with one another, talking to each other. And in fact, for us, it's difficult now to how to keep them in their bubbles, you know, because exams are coming up, because they like spending so much time together. So it's what you provide them. If I give them as a parent full access to the media and to the internet and you know, allow gaming and whatever else they do on it, then I am going to be you know, sort of addicted. But if I am allowed to do it for some time, and I know that reading is also important, looking at nature is also important, and looking, listening to music or doing other things is equally important, or going outside and playing, or playing inside if you can't go outside due to COVID, then I think it brings a different perspective out. Thank you.
So I'm going to come back to a more general and a broader question, Meenakshi. Question I'm reading out is at the end of the question answer by Mr. Rao Chaudhary. I think in different ways he has put this question even at the beginning of the webinar and so on. How can the school culture impact, and I'm going to reverse this, impact family relations and society? I think at an earlier point he said, how does it actually create values and virtues, and how long do these emotions last in them once they leave school? So what is actually the impact of school culture is, I think, the question.
I think, yeah, thanks for this question. It's from what I hear teachers saying to us here in this school, and I'm sure it's the same in other schools, our children also tend to go back and talk about these issues with parents. Many of them bring about changes in their own families, and this is to do with many things, such as simply as waste segregation, as simple as the use of water, and as simple as the use of biodegradable products. I think these things are, once our children understand some of these issues, they take it back to the parents and they insist on certain things, even consumption of clothes, in terms of the simplicity. I think this is communicated back to the parents, and this is how, what teachers have been telling us or sharing with us, that this is how it has been happening. So I think it does go back. Now, whether it impacts the larger society, this is a more difficult question. We don't know how it impacts and whether it can impact the larger society. If parents continue with these changes, you asked how long does it last? I don't know, right? It's up to how, and it's not just the family, but it's the children themselves. If they are able to inculcate certain characteristics of the culture into their own lives, and that becomes an example, whether for the family or for the society, then there is the possibility of change, right? So it's a continuous process. I don't want to pass a judgment that, you know, to this extent we've been successful and we are actually, we don't know. I think it is making an impact. There are parents who listen to their children, who communicate with them, and these kind of changes do take place. But how long they last, I don't know.
And could one also say that it's in the kind of choices of livelihoods that children might make?
Exactly.
The diversity of livelihoods where they feel they could make a difference, where they feel that they're doing something meaningful, and their motivation is not only to get ahead in society.
Exactly, exactly. Thank you, Alok. And also, we have children who sometimes, not just children, they are adults, and they have spent several years being a investment banker, and then they turn to writing as a profession and go to the most violent country in the world in order to write something about it. I think that also speaks to us about somewhere, and come back to the school to talk about it. Somewhere it tells us about what that person has imbibed from the school. Where has that culture penetrated the consciousness of that adult, that it has stayed with him over all his years, and then in his 40s or 50, whenever he goes, makes a professional change. So I think if we look at it in terms of a long vision or a long durée, as a historian put it, in a longer context, then perhaps we can see the impact more than looking at it.
That's been quite a range of questions, and there are many more, I know, from basic questions to more complex ones, but I think we are now coming to the end of our time that we had allotted. So I'm not sure whether, we should take another question. Thank you so much, Meenakshi, for, so gamely taking whatever question was thrown at you and trying your best to respond to it. And I hope I haven't excluded too many of the other questions which people would have liked you to respond to. I just want to add one small thing which was told to me just before the webinar started, that this webinar is one occasion to get familiar with the kind of educational thought which the Krishnamurti schools are in some way about. But there is also a kind of a course for teachers which is conducted twice a year. It's, I think, called The Role of a Teacher in Schools. And any of you participants who might be interested in that, you could just keep a lookout on Facebook or Instagram, or some of these social media are now used for, I think, sharing news of all of these events also. So that may be another place. And someone had asked, are there some books which are recommended to new teachers? I think all that information probably will be available. A few people who have asked for your email ID directly, Meenakshi, I hope you don't mind, I've shared it because they would like to maybe get a copy of the presentation or have some other question. And I have also shared mine with such people. So thank you very much to all the participants. It's been very
Thank you
good
so
to
much.
have all of you here, and I hope the interaction was meaningful for everyone. Now we've come exactly to 4:30, and I think we should be punctual about time. And
thanks to the chair. Thank you.
Okay, so I would like to bring it to an end now. Thank you very much, everyone. We could now, I think, press the leave button. Yeah, it's been a bit unfortunate that we can't see everyone because of the large numbers. I think the format had to be designed in this way. I wish we could have.
Is it possible for someone to send me the questions and the chat box, please?
Yeah,
I really want to see that. I want to look at all the questions. There's so many in the chat and in the Q&A. I'd really appreciate Aishwarya or whoever, somebody.
Yeah, I think the recording will have all of that. Yeah. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Okay. Yeah. There are lots of comments also, I think, which would be worth your reading here. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Goodbye, everyone. Yeah.
Goodbye. Bye.